Well, I'm just delighted to introduce our speaker this morning. Since Sue Hammersmith retired from the presidency of Metropolitan State University 10 years ago, she's taken a deep dive into trying to understand race in America. She was active in anti-racism education in Minnesota, working with the Minnesota Department of Education, Minnesota's Facilitating Racial Equity Collaborative, and the Anti-Racism Study Dialogue Circles. They hosted an annual Overcoming Racism conference, and they initiated a Racial Equity Leadership Institute for educational leaders. Sue's a new member to our fellowship, and I'm just really eager to hear her words from her years of experience and her words of wisdom this morning. So please welcome Sue.
Thank you for letting me be with you this morning and share some of my experiences. And I'd also like to welcome my sister and my brother who are visiting. My sister is from Miami, Florida. She came up to escape the heat. She's a professor, by the way. And my brother Tom is from Southern Indiana, where we grew up. So it's been a real joy visiting with him the last few days. There's a lot to be said about this topic, and I'm going to today just share some of my personal experiences, my own personal experiences with you as a white person. And I would particularly welcome feedback or comments from members here or online who do not identify as white. I don't at all mean to exclude those folks from the conversation. As UU members, here as we see on the wall, we choose to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and we choose to pursue peace, liberty, and justice for all. For me, that's a call to dismantle the racial hierarchy that we've all inherited. I've spent my whole entire life wrestling with America's racial system, but most of the time I was learning about our racial system, what it does to other people, not what it does to white people, like me. This morning I'd like to share some of what I've learned about my racialization as a white person and my quest to dismantle America's racial hierarchy within myself. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Sue Hammersmith. I use the she, her pronouns. I grew up on the land of the Shawnee people in southern Indiana. Where I grew up, I did not feel that race was an issue. It just didn't come up. Everyone in our county was white at the time I was growing up, so we didn't have to deal with school desegregation or inner city crime or voting rights. And even in American history classes, when race did come up occasionally, it was always way in the past or way far away, like in the Deep South or the Far West. It didn't affect me. As a young adult, I thought I had had the privilege of growing up in a bubble of racial innocence, free from prejudice or privilege. Can any of you relate to that kind of? The main lesson I've learned since then is that I did not grow up in a bubble of racial innocence. I grew up in a bubble of racial whiteness. White space, white culture, white knowledge, white history, a white worldview, white habits of behavior, a white self-concept. In college, I majored in anthropology and got a PhD in sociology. It was easy for me to learn about other people's cultures. The challenge for me was to learn about my own ethnic culture, white culture, and how it was governing me. That was never part of the curriculum. Because a fundamental feature of the white racial system is to make itself invisible to white people. You can't fight what you can't see. You can't question what you can't recognize, and you can't correct what you don't know. And part of our racial system in America is to disguise and hide itself from most of us white folks. So today I'm going to share with you some of what I've learned about the racialization of white people like me, how it gets imprinted in us, and how it impacts our relationships, who we are, what we know, how we operate. For me, one breakthrough came when I was asked to recall my earliest memories of race or racial differences. My earliest memories of race come from when I was about 4 years old. My mom took me shopping with her in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. Now, there were no African Americans in my county, but there were a lot of African Americans in Louisville. And that day I saw quite a few. Out on the streets, I saw African American men taking the garbage bags out of the garbage bins or taking objects out that had been thrown away and taking them, putting them in the garbage truck. In the department store, I saw African American women in the ladies' room. They were cleaning toilets. They would wipe off the toilet seat after each customer used it. There was a younger black woman who operated the elevator. She was well-groomed, I remember, and she had a nice uniform. But I noticed my mom's behavior on the elevator. When we got on, my mom said, "Fourth floor." Very businesslike. And then she turned around and just stared straight ahead at the door. We rode in absolute silence. That kind of aloofness was not something I'd ever seen in my mom before. Now, the department store clerks and cashiers were all white, and I could tell that my mom was comfortable around them. They made small talk, they laughed, they exchanged money, said thank you. Now, what did I learn that day? Nobody said a word about race, but I learned a lot. I learned that African Americans were assigned different roles, that they do dirty work that people like us wouldn't want to do, and that a proper woman like my mother doesn't talk to them, smile, or look them in the eye. That shopping trip, of course, was just one set of information for me. I had hundreds of others. We went to movies in my family every week. I watched television, I read books and magazines. In my dad's National Geographics, I often saw lots of pictures of dark-skinned people in exotic places, often with their boobs showing. And my family traveled also. In the Deep South, I saw black folks' shacks along the cotton fields. I saw black women carrying these huge bundles on their head, balancing them. I saw signs for white or colored on drinking fountains or doors. Out west, we camped in a rocky creek bed, I remember, near a family of Mexican farm workers. And my dad would talk to anybody. He was talking to them. They told my dad they were constantly on the move and that their children didn't go to school. They worked in the fields alongside the adults. And I saw lots of American Indians. In the cowboy movies, you know, they were always on horseback, and then they were gone. From the mass media, I also developed a concept of white people and white culture. The white men had nice jobs, and they knew things. The white women had nice clothes and houses. You know the type I'm talking about, Dick Van Dyke, Doris Day, Walter Cronkite. In that imaginary world, people of color only appeared as servants, criminals, or exotic foreigners. Growing up in America, white folks like me get exposed to thousands of race-related stimuli, visual images, sound bites, emotions, interactions. We see systemic racism in practice, even when we're not conscious that's what we're seeing. Researchers say it is typical for American children to learn racist stereotypes by age 3 or 4, even when their parents are totally committed to social justice. All that racial knowledge gets embedded in our subconscious. Neurologists tell us that the human brain can process 11 million bits of information per second, but only about 40 bits per second on a conscious level. The rest is handled subconsciously. It's based on pattern recognition, context, and prior experience. Our subconscious mind makes connections, associations, interpretations, expectations, and reactions before our rational mind even begins to engage. And that's what governs most of our behavior and our perceptions. All this means that white Americans like me can have the very best of intentions, and yet we act out our implicit racial roles and biases. In other words, we're sabotaged by our own subconscious. We may not see it, but I've learned that people of color do see it. They notice the particular word choices we make, when we laugh, when we get offended, what we're comfortable with. They notice when we don't see them, or discount them, or when we get defensive. We may not be conscious of our white practices and behaviors, but people of color recognize them because they've seen them all 100 times before. They recognize the pattern. I expect there are a lot of well-intentioned white people like me. I spent my entire career in higher education as faculty or administrator. When I entered higher education in the 1970s, the Midwestern universities were in the very early stages of racial desegregation. But the times were changing. There were calls for universities to become more culturally diverse and inclusive in the student body, faculty and staff, in the curriculum. And I had the privilege of working on those fronts with a whole lot of other well-intentioned white people and some people of other racial backgrounds. I learned a lot. I thought I was pretty successful. But in retrospect, I see that I still didn't quite get it. I wasn't conscious of being white or having a white culture or acting white. I just thought it was normal. Colleagues of color would tell me that they saw racism in the university every single day, that they had to leave their ethnic identities at the door. And they would tell me when well-intentioned white folks, including me, made mistakes. I didn't see that my notion of inclusion just meant welcoming people of color into a totally white university, a totally white institution. I've learned that part of what America's racial system does to disadvantage people, but I had not learned what the racial system does to people like me. And I would like to share some of what I've learned and what I believe we need to know before we can be free or better. So what does the racial system do to well-intentioned white people like me? It lies to us. It educates us into ignorance. It teaches us that race actually exists, when scientifically, genetically, it doesn't. Race is a cultural concept, not a scientific concept or an objective classification. America's racial system also teaches us a whitewashed version of history. In fact, I think historical amnesia is a central feature of white culture. It tells us an American creation story that is largely mythological. It teaches us a version of history that is so selective and incomplete as to be almost an exercise in nonsense. This is why ethnic studies and cultural critical race theory are so threatening to the white establishment. If we white people were educated about our racial system, we would see it. We could change it. We could truly be in community with people who are different from us, and that would disrupt the status quo. Our racial system also gives people like me a false self-concept. If we're successful, it tells us we're smarter, better, and more deserving than others. It tells us the U.S. is the land of meritocracy. And if people of color don't succeed, it's their own fault. And if young white men don't succeed, as they're entitled to since they're white, either they must be personally inadequate or other people like immigrants or liberals are stealing their share of the pie. Mm-hmm. It makes folks like me arrogant also. It allows us to discount what Black or Indigenous people or other minorities tell us about their concerns, their experiences in the workplace or in school or with police, or the obstacles they face. When they do point out an instance of racial bias, it allows us to say, no, you're wrong, that wasn't his intention. It also allows white people like me, especially if we're in a position of influence or power, to think that we know the solution to a problem better than the people who are actually suffering from the problem. Finally, and this one is hard to reckon with for me, it makes us ashamed. One African-American UU minister, Reverend Thandeka, claims that white racial shame is a fundamental dimension of white racial identity, that it is often one of the first things white children learn, even when their parents don't realize they're learning it. And I could relate to that. I remember when I was in 4th grade, I've never told my older sister this. I got a pen pal, a girl my age. She lives someplace in the Caribbean, and I was always so excited to get her letters. She'd tell me about her family and her school and her activities, and she was my new best friend. Then one day, I opened a letter, and she had enclosed her school picture. And I looked at it, and she looked like the African Americans in Louisville. And I looked at that picture, and I felt really ashamed. Somehow I knew what I had done was wrong. I have no idea how. I never told anybody about it, but I tore up her picture, I burned all of her letters, and I never wrote her again. I felt ashamed of cutting her off because I knew that was wrong. But I also felt ashamed of myself for having befriended her in the first place because I should have known better. Reverend Thandeka says that the standard for white, our image of white, is the upper 10 to 15% of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle class. It's not just about skin color. It's about class and wealth and God. She says that people who don't fit that upper middle class Anglo-Saxon mold feel a sense of shame that they're not quite white enough. And I have, in my struggles to understand what's going on in America today, I've wondered how many MAGA supporters wrestle deep down with that kind of shame that they're not quite as successful as they should be. I felt it. I grew up in Greater Appalachia. My friends said ain't and y'all. Indoor plumbing was not the norm. Teenage pregnancy was common. I never forgot where I came from, but I was past 40 years old before I would tell anybody where I came from. And I never went back to visit my friends. Perhaps most important, America's racial system fragments us as human beings. I think we're meant to be in relationships with other human beings, to be in beloved community. But the racial system isolates us from others. And one thing we have to do is recognize, I think, just how isolated we are and how different other people's experiences, family stories, community histories are. I'll give you one quick example. My current co-author is an African-American woman, my age, similar professional status. Her parents grew up in southern Mississippi, and every summer her family would go back. They'd visit with grandparents and the cousins. She loved that. Her father told her about his favorite cousin and best friend growing up in southern Mississippi. One day when they were about 12 years old, his cousin was riding his bicycle in the nearby town there in southern Mississippi, and something happened with his bike and it wobbled and he almost fell off, but he got it straightened back up. And he looked up. When he looked up, he accidentally made eye contact with a white woman. He knew that was wrong. He went home, he told his parents what he had done, and they tried to calm him down, but after nightfall, a group of white men came from the town. They took the 12-year-old boy from his parents down to the river, and they killed him. When you have family stories like that, You experience life differently. Current events have a different impact. When George Floyd was killed, for example, I was very upset. But I still don't fear being stopped by the police, you know. And I still don't worry about whether the young men in my family will be able to come home at night. But I remain hopeful. I take courage from the generations of indigenous people, African Americans and others who came before us, and yet they persisted and survived. When we have the courage to connect across our differences, to celebrate our common humanity, listen deeply, love and learn, we can become a new people, and I think we can forge a new way toward that community of liberty and justice and peace that you seek. I'd like to close with a poem that I wrote just over 30 years ago, celebrating 3 of the African American women that I was blessed to have in my life. White sisters, you starve yourself to death. You want to be but a wisp. You have no voice. Your mothers raised you on fairy tales of passive beauty, rescued by a stranger prince. They had no choice. White sisters, you hide your extra pounds in dark. You idolize Twiggy's skin and bones and Jackie's not much more, whose little girl voice concealed her soul. You wither on your vine and call us slaves? Wake up, woman. Listen to my mother. Kidnapped, raped, abandoned, but never quite destroyed. Never enslaved in spirit. She carries herself with dignity. Her name is strong. Her beauty was born of the African sun. Her strength of struggles she survived. She has her pride. Her pounds are hers, and if they come, she wears them proud with color and adorned. Her mother taught her how to rear her young and work and keep her soul. She had no choice. She taught her to try harder, be better, endure more, to pray and listen to the inner voice. She has roots to the center of the universe and a spirit that will not fade nor hide. Her presence, like the pyramids, assumes its place on earth with awesome pride. Find her, white girl. She can be your teacher if you will. Nourish you, encourage you. Listen to her strong, almighty voice and take your rightful place as sisters under the sun. Thank you. Thank you.